Welcome to Calm Historian. Tonight we trace the hoofbeats of the Mongol Empire across Asia, from the windswept steppe to Silk Road cities changed forever. Comment with your location and your current local time, and if this gentle journey suits you, please like and subscribe. Listen, the world once heaved to the rhythm of hooves. In 1206, a warrior named Temujin took a single, thunderous step toward history and was proclaimed Genghis Khan, universal ruler. From that moment, the nomads of the Eurasian steppe, people who had for centuries lived by seasons and grass, became the architects of a realm that would stretch across continents and endure, in one form or another, until 1368. To understand how they did it, imagine the cold, clear dawns of the steppe, riders wrapped in felt and leather, banners quivering like flocks of black birds, moved across the horizon. The horses themselves seemed taught by the open land, lean, tireless, trained to answer commands in a heartbeat. The riders practiced until the long sounds of bowstrings and saddles became a kind of music, the metallic ring of bow against saddle, the whisper of leather. Their methods were elemental and terrible, speed that outpaced any foot soldier, archery from a moving mount, formations that could bend and then snap like steel. Where their opponents expected a steady line, the Mongols offered sudden movement, feigned flight, and the cold discipline to encircle and finish what they began. Their campaigns reached astonishing places. To the east they advanced against China's great cities and imperial centers, laying siege to crowded, walled places such as Kaifeng. Those sieges tested inventiveness on both sides. Sappers, engineers, desperate defenders and attackers who learned as much from failure as from success. To the south and west, their horses thundered through mountain passes and fertile valleys, Georgia's rugged hills, Iran's rich courts, the cities of Iraq. They crossed high country that later generations would call Kyrgyzstan, bringing into their orbit peoples and polities with languages, faiths, and customs very different from those of the steppe. When the Mongol host brushed against Europe, the shock was deep and immediate. On plains they had never seen before, they faced armored knights and footmen who relied on heavy armor and fixed formations. At Legnica and at Mohi, the suddenness of Mongol tactics, light cavalry feigning retreat, then turning to encircle, left European commanders bewildered. Those battles were not merely military defeats, and they were moments when the old order discovered a level of mobility and tactical cunning it had not imagined. But the Mongol world was more than a war machine. It became a network of roads and routes, of emissaries and caravans, of messages and goods flowing across deserts and rivers. Popes and princes sent envoys, sometimes to plead, sometimes to learn. Merchants followed the paths carved by conquest, finding in Mongol order a safety of sorts that allowed trade and ideas to move with unusual speed for the era. Franciscan Giovanni da Pian del Carpini traveled to the court of the great Khan and returned with accounts that opened European eyes to a polity both strange and compelling. Another traveler, Willem van Ruysbroek, moved among those lands and brought back vivid impressions of courtly life, rituals, rumors, and a sense of an expanse that seemed to stretch beyond comprehension. Leadership after Genghis took its own shape. Ogedei, one of his successors, oversaw a period of consolidation and further outward push, adding new territories and cementing systems of rule. Later, in the east, Kublai Khan would give the Mongol line a different face. In China, Mongol rule intersected with imperial institutions and long-established bureaucratic practices. Both nomadic customs and settled governance changed under that pressure, remaking the texture of daily life and power. The story is not one of unbroken triumph. The Mongols reshaped cities, altered populations, and provoked resistance that would grow through time. In the lands of Ruses, a long shadow of domination settled over principalities, and that shadow eventually met determined challenge. The Battle of Kulikovo stands in later memory as a turning point, a costly, determined refusal to live under steppe rule, a sign that empires, no matter how vast, stir up the will to resist. Even where conquest held, the Mongol imprint was not simply stamped and erased. Their presence braided into local economies, migrations, artistic forms, and administrative practices across China, Georgia, Iran, Iraq, and the highlands of Central Asia. Caravan routes and postal stations, legal customs and artistic motifs, population movements and new systems of taxation linked far-off places in ways that lasted beyond the fall of Mongol political power. So when you ask what the Mongol Empire was and how it spread, picture the steppe and the riders who made it their world. Picture the speed of their mounts, the precision of their formations, the cunning of commanders who could turn a retreat into a trap. Remember the sieges at Kaifeng, the thunder of battle at Legnica and Mohi, the envoys like Giovanni and Willem who carried tales back west, and the rulers, Genghis, the Ogedei, Kublai, whose decisions altered the maps of governance. From 1206 to 1368, the clatter of hooves and the will of a people from the grasslands remade a vast and varied world. The story begins on an endless plain where the wind seems to have no opinion but to move steadily east and west, and the grass bends like the sea. This is the Mongol heartland, a raw, unadorned landscape of sky and steppe in Central Asia, where people lived by the rhythm of seasons and the pace of horses. From this austere place in the year 1206, a single decisive moment set the course for a transformation the world had not yet imagined. There, amid tents and smoke and the clatter of hooves, a man the world would come to call Genghis Khan rose from the ranks of rival clans and through force of will, kinship, and military skill forged a new unity. What began as the consolidation of nomadic bands became the foundation of an empire. Picture new banners snapping in the cold light, riders tightening reins and tightening bonds as old feuds were turned into new purpose. The Mongol warriors were not merely soldiers. They were horsemen shaped by the steppe's harshness, quick, mobile, and intimately acquainted with long distances. Their world was the horizon, and under the leadership that coalesced in 1206, that horizon began to move outward. Campaigns folded mountains and deserts, rivers and cities into a single sweep of power. The growth was both astonishing and inexorable, a series of movements that carried them from their homeland into regions that had once seemed separated by too many miles or too much history to be bridged. By the late 13th century, the scope of that momentum had become almost unimaginable. From the salt-scented surf of the Pacific in the east to the broad Danube and the warm shores near the Persian Gulf in the west, the Mongol realm stretched across continents. Imagine a cloak of authority draped over Eurasia, touching seaports and steppes, river valleys and plateaus, linking peoples and places who had rarely, if ever, shared a single dominion. At its greatest reach, this dominion covered some 9 million square miles, 23 million square kilometers, a vastness that makes the mind reel, and the map looks suddenly crowded with possibility. In terms of continuous land, no empire before or since has matched that sweep. Yet the image of endless conquest does not erase the human texture woven through it. The tired faces by campfires, the merchants whose caravans now crossed longer distances, the governors and villagers who found themselves under new rules, the languages and customs brushing up against one another on newly shared roads. This is a story of immense reach, sprouting from a single, stark landscape. Of the steppes children who, in 1206, set out from tents and horses to redraw the world's borders. It is a story of scale and speed, of horizons extended until the earth itself seemed to shrink, and of an extraordinary chapter in human history that, at its peak, stood as the largest contiguous land empire the world has ever known. The year was 1206. On the windswept banks of the Onon River, where tall grasses rippled like a restless sea beneath a wide, empty sky, a turning point in history was quietly taking shape. Men who had been rivals stood shoulder to shoulder, their faces browned by sun and wind, their horses stamping in the mud. They had come from scattered camps and distant valleys, Mongol-speaking clans and Turkic tribes, a loose, fractious patchwork of people bound by custom, blood, and necessity. On that day, those thin threads were braided into something new. At the center of the gathering was Temujin, son of Yesugei. For years he had been one among many, a tribal leader who fought for place and honor on the broad plains south and southeast of Lake Baikal. He had known hunger and exile, made alliances and enemies, suffered betrayals, and learned the hard arithmetic of life on the steppe, where a single winter or a single victory could change a man's fate. Still, by 1206, he had become more than a survivor. The steadiness of his command, the careful planning of his campaigns, and the high demands he put on himself and his followers moved him from the margins of power into its very center. When the assembled chieftains made their choice, they placed upon Temujin a new name and a new role. Genghis Khan. That moment was not merely a change of title. It was the first living breath of an empire. In elevating a single leader, the horse peoples attempted something novel. They bound Mongol-speaking clans and allied Turkic groups into a single political body, a federation that reached beyond old loyalties and narrow feuds. What drove them to that decision were hard, practical realities rather than miracles. In the years before, Temujin had defeated powerful rivals. He moved decisively against the Kermtum and the Naiman, two of the most formidable Turkic polities in the region. Those fights were more than clashes of men and horses. They were struggles for leadership, for the loyalty of warriors and the allegiance of tribal networks. His victories shattered the last serious resistance to a single authority across the grasslands. Rival war bands were absorbed, scattered, or broken, and those who survived learned that joining Temujin offered a path to survival, to rank, and to reward. So with campfires smoking and long banners snapping in the wind, the fate of what is now Mongolia was sealed. Temujin's elevation to Genghis Khan concentrated authority that had been fiercely contested and fragmented for generations. The wide landscape, from river valleys to ridges and open steppe, which had been a patchwork of warring clans, now came under a single, commanding will. The new federation included not only native Mongol speakers, but many Turkic tribes, whose leaders chose cooperation over continued bloodletting. Yet this was not an endpoint. It was a beginning. The election of 1206 set in motion a period of relentless activity. From the plains unfurled a string of campaigns, sometimes launched in rapid succession, sometimes opened at multiple fronts at once, as the newly unified force tested itself and pushed outward. These operations, coordinated and purposeful, were the practical engine by which authority was enforced and extended across a vast and unruly territory. In the hush that followed the great gathering along the Onon, life on the steppe looked much the same. The hooves, the hearth smoke, the long wind. But the direction of the wind had changed. A federation that mixed Mongol and Turkic elements now had a name, a center, and momentum. From that moment forward, the region's story was written in the rhythm of campaigns and in the iron discipline of a leader whose climb began as one man's stubborn struggle, and in 1206 became the dawn of an empire. The wind that once sighed along the Silk Road still seemed to carry traces of smoke and conflict, stand among the crumbling streets of Jiaohe, where houses were cut into the loess and steep cliffs kept watch like a forgotten fortress, and you could almost hear those first thunderous years. Caravans that had threaded this ribbon of sand for 1,000 years, laden with silk and spices, languages and prayers, were interrupted by a new force from the steppe. The chronicles are blunt. Jiaohe was destroyed in the 13th century by the armies of Genghis Khan. To imagine that loss is to picture more than a date. Halted camels, merchants clutching purse and prayer, the sharp cry of horses, doors broken in, and then the long, patient silence that followed when the fury moved on. Before the dust settled over Jiaohe, the young Mongol state had already begun its first major campaigns. Between 1205 and 1209, the Mongols directed their opening blows at the Tangut kingdom of Xixia, a realm tucked on China's northwestern fringe. Those years were not a single pitched battle, but a steady drumbeat of raids, negotiations, and pressure. The Mongols were driven by a mixture of ambition and necessity, a people shaped by open grass and mountain passes who had learned to expand or perish. After 4 years of campaigning, the Xixia king formally declared allegiance. That submission did not simply end a war. It folded a long-established kingdom into the orbit of an empire that had only recently grown from tribal confederations into a centralized force. From there, the Mongol gaze turned east. The great fortified realms of northern China, ruled at the time by the Jin dynasty, faced an enemy unlike any they had known. The Jin had built their power around cities, walls, and the riverine networks of the Yellow River. They were accustomed to sieges and courtly intrigue, not to an opponent whose strength lay in speed, mobility, and relentless strategy. Campaign after campaign pushed down from the steppes, and in 1215 the turning point arrived. The ancient city of Beijing, the Jin capital, fell to the Mongols. With that loss, territory north of the Huanghe, the Yellow River, slipped from Jin hands into the new Mongol order. A river that had once marked familiar zones of culture and command now watched borders being redrawn under riders from the plains. Stripped of its northern dominance, the Jin dynasty found itself diminished and increasingly trapped between two worlds. Pressed from the north by a rising empire, and from the south by the venerable Song court, the Jin became a buffer state in name and function. Their rule continued over certain cities and peoples, but real authority was eroded, their strategies narrowed. To be a buffer was to be both protector and hostage, a realm holding territory while its future was shaped by powers on either side. The Mongol momentum did not stop at China's doorstep. Westward campaigns followed the arteries of trade that had long linked east and west, and these movements were deliberate attempts to secure key lands and the networks that ran across them. One crucial acquisition came in 1218, when the Karakitai state in East Turkestan, a multi-ethnic power that had long controlled important stretches of the Silk Road, was drawn into the Mongol sphere. Bringing that region under Mongol influence meant seizing control of routes, riches, and the movement of goods that connected China with the wider world. Caravans that once traveled with a degree of independence now increasingly moved beneath the shadow of a single, expanding imperial will. Through sieges, oaths, and absorptions, the human landscape was remade. Fortified cities like Beijing, centers of governance, learning, and craft, passed from one hand to another with walls scarred and markets rearranged. Border kingdoms such as Xixia negotiated survival and identity in the shadow of a power that would not easily be ignored. Silk Road towns, from bustling caravanserai to tiny desert hamlets, were forced to adapt or disappear. In places like Jiaohe, the aftermath of those years became a visible language. Empty streets where traders once bartered, hollow windows watching the sand, bazaars reduced to skeletal traces of trade in both goods and dreams. There is a harsh beauty to this history, a clarity born of steppe life meeting the complexity of settled civilizations. The Mongol expansions of the early 13th century were more than battles and treaties recorded in court annals. They were storms that reshaped the political and economic map of Asia. Between 1205 and 1218, whole regions were drawn into a new imperial order, Xixia bending in allegiance, Beijing falling and the banks of the Yellow River changing hands, the Jin reduced to a precarious intermediary, and the Karakitai absorbed into a growing dominion. In the silent ruins of Jiaohe, you can still hear that transformation like an echo. A world remade by horse and bow, by strategies honed on the open horizon, and by a people who turned the endless steppe into an empire. The spark that set a sweeping chain of events in motion was, by the standards of diplomacy, almost small and horribly local. The massacre of Muslim subjects of Genghis Khan at Otrar by agents of the Khwarezmian state. That outrage turned a simmering tension into full-scale war between the Mongols and the Sultanate of Khwarezm. Between 1219 and 1225, the Mongol war machine rolled across West Turkestan, and cities that had stood for centuries as centers of learning and trade were stormed and sacked. Bukhara, Samarkand, and the capital Urgench fell in 1221, their libraries burned, their markets shattered. Mongol detachments did not stop at the traditional borders of Islamic Central Asia. After crossing the Caucasus, advanced troops pushed into the fringes of southern Russia, and in 1243 raided ports and towns along the Crimean coast. The land of Khwarezm, once fertile, prosperous, threaded with canals and crisscrossed by merchant routes, paid a steeper price than the immediate ruin of walls and palaces. The invaders' wrecking of irrigation systems undermined agriculture at its roots. and the aftermath lingered for centuries. Towns emptied, fields turned to dust or salt, and the rhythms of rural life that had sustained whole regions were broken. At nearly the same moment, another campaign unfolded with equal ruthlessness. In 1226-27, the Mongols turned on Xia, the Tangut kingdom to the west of the Chinese heartland, because its ruler had refused to support Genghis Khan's expedition against Khwarezm. The assault was brutal and relentless. Genghis Khan died during that campaign in 1207, and his passing only sharpened the Mongols' edge of vengeance. The Xia culture, a delicate weave of Chinese and Tibetan influences with Buddhism as its state faith, was devastated. Monasteries and texts were destroyed, and what remained of their society was scattered and diminished. By 1227, when the sun rose over an empire that seemed to have no edges, the word Mongol had become a presence on the map from sea to sea. Imagine a ribbon of rule unrolling east until it met the China Sea, then turning west across steppe and desert to the Caspian's inland shores. That sweep was more than a line of flags. It stitched together mountains and plains, deserts and river valleys, folding a huge variety of landscapes and peoples under a single shadow. The Mongol realm met different worlds at its borders. To the north, the empire ran up against a quiet belt of sparse forest and the beginning of Siberia, a land thinly settled by people who lived at their own slow, cold pace. To the south, the frontier pressed into great natural barriers, the jagged knots of the Pamirs, the high plateaus of Tibet, and the irrigated plains of central China where settled farming had long set its own rhythm. Between those limits, the empire enclosed valleys where traders bartered in dozens of tongues, pastoral corridors where mounted herdsmen moved like weather, and cities whose walls had known empires before the Mongol shadow arrived. That vast territory was no single, simple people. It was a living mosaic, nomads and merchants, clerics and craftsmen, monks and townsfolk, caravanserais and market squares, felt tents pitched beside stone walls. Within the empire, ideas and faiths rubbed shoulders, languages met and mingled in bazaars. Legal customs and administrative practices had to find ways to live together across astonishing distances. To govern such diversity required more than force. It demanded practical systems of administration, networks of communication, and an uneasy tolerance that could keep trade flowing even when loyalties were divided. To understand why such an empire arose, we have to look at an older, recurring tension. The friction between the pastoral nomads of the steppe and the settled agricultural civilizations they bordered. This was not a cartoon of two fixed types clashing. It was a long-standing confrontation rooted in different economies and life rhythms. Nomads built their lives around mobility, herds, migrations, weather, and pasture, while settled peoples invested in fields, irrigation, granaries, and permanent structures that anchored communities through seasons and generations. Where these worlds met, competition for resources and control often followed. For centuries, that contact had produced cycles of raids and retaliation, mounted bands sweeping down to seize animals, exact tribute, or press fleeting advantage. Those raids were a violent punctuation mark in the longer arc of trade and diplomacy across the steppe. What changed under Genghis Khan was scale and intent. Violence was not only episodic anymore, it became organized, continuous, and aimed at permanent dominion. The seasonal pressures of pastoral life, the wealth of settled lands, and the new unity of steppe leadership combined to create an expansion that carried beyond opportunistic plunder. Two truths help explain the moment. First, the sheer scope of the transformation, an expansion that left the pastoral horizon behind and reached to govern whole regions with their own histories and sovereignties. Second, the motives were complicated and intertwined. Security mattered, control of pastures and trade routes, the desire to ensure tribute and vital resources. Status and the ethos of leadership in steppe societies pushed ambitious commanders to prove themselves. There was also calculated statecraft, organized administration and logistics, and an element of revenge when slights and refusals were answered with overwhelming force. By 1227, the result was plain for contemporaries to see. The Mongol polity astonished its neighbors and rewrote the map. It fused the mobility and martial skill of nomadic life with the administrative demands of ruling distant cities and diverse peoples. From sea to sea, it cast a long shadow, one that reshaped trade, warfare, and the lives of millions, leaving a legacy of both destruction and the uneasy order of a new, vast dominion. Imagine the vast steppe stretching to the horizon, a sea of grass that rippled under a sky promising freedom and fate. Riders and herds moved like weather across that plain. Horses were more than livestock. They were the measure of power. From this open country rose leaders whose ambitions reached far beyond seasonal migration or the next raid. Genghis Khan, and many who followed him, carried a vision that made conquest feel like destiny. A sense that they were meant to bring the world under one rule. A heavenly mission that gave their campaigns a grandeur and a cosmic justification. That claim to universal reign did not spring simply from nomadic life. The steppe's social fabric, clan ties, councils of elders, fierce local independence, favored agility and consensus, not empire. Pastoral economies lived by herds and orisons, and power was often local and fleeting. The language of a single, moral realm was something borrowed from the South. Chinese political thought had long imagined the world as Tianxia, one realm under one ruler, a system that tied moral order, ceremony, and sovereignty together. When steppe leaders took up those ideas, they found a way to dress raids in the robes of legitimacy. With that new language of rulership, the loose confederations of riders began to change shape. What had been seasonal alliances and ad hoc war bands hardened into empires capable of moving millions of mounted men across vast distances. The trick was turning mobile strength into lasting dominion. Ambitious khans and chieftains pressed down from the grasslands into the more settled lands of Central Asia, the oasis towns, the irrigated plains, the merchant cities where silk and spices changed hands, where coins clinked and scholars kept records. From those footholds, the aim could swell into something global, to fold these rich, sedentary worlds into a single political order, and to claim the prestige that came with ruling a vast, ordered realm. Underlying many of these moves was a practical calculation about communication and commerce. Central Asia sat at the crossroads of continents, stitched together by overland trade routes. Caravans threaded between oasis cities carrying silk, spices, new ideas and technologies, and wealth that could tip balances of power. To control those arteries of trade was to control the lifeblood of faraway economies, to collect revenue, and to gain the symbolic advantage of linking east and west. The Silk Road ceased to be merely a route for goods. It became a prize in its own right, a network worth seizing. Yet alongside ideology and strategy, there was the blunt lure of plunder. Nomad armies saw in walled cities what the steppe could not produce: full granaries, workshops crowded with artisans, libraries of books, and treasuries of coin. Boots, horses, precious metals, and bolts of silk were tangible rewards that enriched rulers and bound followers to them. The hope of booty shaped where campaigns began, how they were fought, and why certain regions were struck hardest. So the earliest assaults by nomadic coalitions were often aimed at the states that profited from controlling those trade corridors. Caravan hubs, border forts, market towns, the points where Silk Road paths converged, were natural targets. Seizing them not only captured wealth, but cut off rivals' incomes and wrested control of the routes themselves. In doing so, these horse-borne forces did more than raid. They rewrote maps of influence across continents, replacing scattered sovereignties with the reach of a single power on horseback. The story of conquest on the steppe is a tapestry woven from different threads, ideas of universal rule, borrowed and adapted, the practical habits of a nomadic life, a strategic hunger for the routes that linked worlds, and the simple human urge to take what others had. Together they propelled figures like Genghis Khan and those who came after him to turn open landscapes into stepping stones for empire, pursuing a dignity framed as a heavenly mission, while also claiming the very real spoils that made a realm hold. Across the grasslands, banners snapped in the wind, and the distant clatter of hooves carried silk and banners, law and loot toward a new order. The Mongol conquests read like a story of speed and intellect, more than a tale of overwhelming numbers. Under Genghis Khan and the rulers who followed him, what made the Mongols terrifying on the battlefield was not simply the size of their armies, but the way those armies thought, moved, and acted, always as a single, lethal organism honed to exploit space and time. They were, above all, a cavalry people, lives and warcraft, bound to the gait of horses, giving them a mobility that stunned opponents raised to fight on foot or behind cumbersome defensive lines. Where enemies expected a ponderous massed charge, the Mongols offered rhythm and distance, riders who could appear, vanish, and reappear like shadows blown across the plain. Picture them crossing the great open steppe. Compact riders taut in the saddle, pale light flashing on leather and metal, horses' manes streaming. Their formations could spread into thin, flexible screens that hid intent and protected flanks, or snap together to deliver a concentrated strike. Movement itself was a weapon. By choosing the time and place of combat, probing an enemy's weakness, and then pressing only where resistance had been broken, they turned each campaign into a single, patient plan unfolding across the land rather than a string of separate fights. At the heart of that plan was communication. Their maneuvers were not left to chance, but directed by rehearsed signals and a messenger network that served as the army's nervous system. Flags, horns, and banners cut through the clatter of hooves and the dust of the plains, sending simple, clear instructions. Mounted couriers carried orders and intelligence from unit to unit, so a commander's intent traveled as fast as his troops. The result was a harmony of motion, detachments moving at the same tempo, retreats orderly, advances coordinated, and surprises that could be orchestrated dozens of miles away. In battle, the Mongols sought to create disorder first, and only to engage in close combat once the enemy had been broken. Their primary weapon was the composite bow, shot with deadly accuracy from horseback. Imagine lines of riders sweeping past an enemy formation, arrows filling the air in a staccato rattle of flight and impact, a rain of shafts that thinned ranks and shattered morale. The aim was often as much to bend an enemy's formation as it was to kill individual soldiers, forcing mistakes and gaps to be exploited. Only after those ranks had been torn apart, once cohesion and will were eroded, would the Mongols press in with swords, lances, and brutal hand-to-hand fighting. That sequence of distant harassment, followed by merciless close struggle, repeated with grim efficiency on fields where open ground and clear sight lines favored cavalry. Their tactics were imaginative and disciplined in the small as well as the large. Feints, probes, and coordinated withdrawals that lured opponents into making fatal errors. Their strengths were most obvious on broad, flat expanses of steppe and plain. There, speed, sight, and room to maneuver were multiplied. How riders could wheel, regroup, and rain fire while keeping the force intact. In broken, wooded, or mountainous country, those advantages faded. Forests and steep slopes constrained movement, denied visibility, and turned cavalry from a devastating asset into a cumbersome burden. In such terrain, the Mongols had to adjust their playbook, or risk losing the very advantages that made them so dangerous. When their ambitions brought them to walled cities and fortified centers of sedentary life, the Mongols adapted with the same practical ruthlessness that marked their field tactics. A nomadic horse warrior alone could not reduce a stone fortress. So conquered people's artisans and engineers were put to work. Craftsmen, especially Chinese, Persian, and Arab specialists with long traditions in construction, metallurgy, and mechanics, were pressed into service to design siege machines, undermine walls, and exploit breaching techniques the Mongols themselves had not developed. With these hands and minds at work, mobility and coordination could be translated into instruments for overcoming gates and towers. Seen together, those elements explain why the Mongol military machine was so effective. It combined radical mobility shaped by cavalry, a finely tuned system of communication, fighting methods that favored disruption before engagement, and a pragmatic willingness to incorporate foreign expertise when needed. The emerging picture is not of a faceless horde, but of a lean, adaptive power. Riders and couriers moving like weather across the land, commanders reading the ground like a map, archers filling the horizon with flight, and engineers, captives turned craftsmen, learning to turn walls into rubble. That combination of speed, discipline, and practical intelligence underpinned the Mongols' extraordinary achievements and made them one of the most formidable military forces of their age. Wind swept across the plains, and long before any spear flashed in the sun, the threads of strategy were already being woven. The Mongol campaigns were not only campaigns of horses and arrows, they were campaigns of information. Spies moved ahead like shadows, not merely as scouts, but as instruments of a larger design, mapping a city's defenses, learning which leaders might bend, listening for quarrels that could be turned into openings. Their reports came back in hurried hands and were translated into action. At the same time, a quieter weapon was set loose. Stories, warnings, promises, a kind of thunderless thunder that rolled through marketplaces and court chambers, Rumors of mercy for those who yielded, of devastation for those who did not, were spread with craft and purpose, until the reputation of the approaching force preceded it and stripped many communities of the will to resist. When the moment came to offer an ultimatum, it was presented with a formal, almost ritual clarity. Envoys rode forward and asked for voluntary surrender. They offered peace. The terms were plain and direct, spoken not in the heat of combat, but in the cool arithmetic of survival. For many the choice was stark. Open the gates and keep your homes, your families, your lives, or hold fast and risk everything. Where peace was accepted, the consequences were immediate and life-altering in ways both brutal and merciful. Those who surrendered were spared slaughter. In many cases, they were allowed to remain on their lands, to continue the daily rounds beneath the same sky, but now under a new authority. Sometimes, people who had once watched Mongol banners with fear found themselves looked upon instead as valuable contributors. Warriors who had fought for local chiefs might be folded into a larger force, their banners replaced by the Khan's, their swords turned to new campaigns as federates, allied troops fighting under unfamiliar command. It was not a matter of impersonal treaties. The Mongol strategy turned conquest into incorporation, and personal loyalty to the Khan mattered above all. Bonds were made face-to-face, in oaths and pledges, in gestures that tied men and rulers by obligation and honor, rather than by parchment, inked in negotiation halls. Rarely were loyalties recorded in dust and ink. They were spoken and seen, sworn in courts and by campfires. That simplicity of allegiance produced something paradoxical, an army with a Mongol name that was, on the ground, a composite. Ethnic Mongols often formed only a minority of the soldiers. The majority, in numbers and in expertise, came from the peoples who had been brought into the fold. They had surrendered, been recruited, or been compelled to fight alongside their former enemies. They served not because of distant paperwork, but because their leaders had pledged themselves to one man, and because service offered a place in the new order. Loyalty to the Khan, once given, reoriented lives, careers, and communities. Scenes of surrender could be both weary and awkward. Once belligerent enemies stood side by side. Warriors exchanged wary glances and then hands. New recruits often slipped into roles that suited their old lives. Riders became the backbone of cavalry units. Guides turned intimate knowledge of roads and passes into military advantage. Craftsmen who had labored at hearth and anvil found their skills prized by patrons more demanding and better equipped than before. The conquerors understood the value of such people. They were not indiscriminately discarded. Those with special talents, armorers, healers, navigators, logisticians, were commonly spared worse fates and set to work for their new masters. In this way, the Mongol war machine became not merely a force of destruction, but an engine that repurposed human labor and expertise into tools of continued expansion. Cities reshaped their workshops to the needs of a mobile empire. Wheels, forges, and harnesses were pressed into service to keep armies moving. Scholars and scribes, too, found roles translating laws and correspondence for a growing realm. The conquerors pried usefulness from ruin and stitched it into the fabric of their campaigns. Yet for those who resisted, the response could be merciless. When a city trusted its walls or alliances rather than the offer of accommodation, the consequences could be uncompromising. Whole populations could be swept away in mass slaughter. Survivors could be bound and sent to distant markets or pressed into servitude. The instruments of terror were terrible and exacting, wielded with the cold logic of deterrence. Make one example so fierce that the next town might prefer the uncertain mercy of surrender to the grim certainty of resistance. Even in these dark calculations, the conquerors discriminated to a degree, not out of mercy but out of calculation, sparing those whose skills had use. In cities emptied by slaughter, artisans, metal workers, and others with rare talents were often singled out and kept alive, set to rebuild what had been destroyed or to craft what the conquerors required. Over and over, the result was an empire built as much from incorporation as from conquest. The armies that rode under the Mongol standard became a tapestry of origins and languages, bound together by the simple, binding thread of personal allegiance to a single leader. Fear was turned into submission, submission into service, and service into power. That process reshaped social orders. Neighbors who had once been enemies now found themselves arrayed under a common command, their loyalties redirected by oath and opportunity. The human landscape shifted with each decision to yield or fight. Families that had sheltered under one banner found themselves living under another. Villages emptied or repopulated. Craftsmen redistributed to workshops that served distant courts. Places remembered the changes. In silence and ruin, in rebuilt markets, and in the uneasy quiet that followed each campaign. It was a strategy that relied not only on force, but on a relentless understanding of the human heart, what people feared, what they valued, and what bargains they would make when the shadow of the Khan passed over their fields, when the name of Genghis Khan rode across the map of the known world. It arrived not as a whisper, but as the steady tramp of 1,000 hooves. The Mongol ascendancy swept into a landscape of settled powers, kingdoms and empires whose governments tasted of permanence, sprawling bureaucracies, paved avenues of tax collectors and court officials, cities ringed by stone walls. The Mongols came from a different world, one made of shifting skies and the sway of felt tents, of laws learned on the run rather than written in ink. That contrast between the permanence of city and the mobility of steppe set the stage for a confrontation that would reshape whole regions. On the wide steppe, social order was spoken in kinship terms. Families stretched through generations in patrilineal lines, clans gathered under banners. Loyalties were personal and dispersed. A Mongol's life revolved around horses and herds, the rhythm of grazing and migration, the weather that decided fortunes. There was no vast civil service to issue orders in the name of a people, no hierarchy of ministries tracing paper along fixed routines. Authority radiated from local leaders and military commanders, men whose power was proved as much by the point of a spear as by birthright. That habit of decentralized rule was the default the conquerors carried with them. What followed was a collision of two worlds. The conquerors were often few compared with the dense populations living beneath city roofs. They were outsiders, foreign raiders in the eyes of those they subdued. Still they arrived with a fierce resolve to refashion social order in their own image. In practice, that meant trying to graft the steppe's social structure onto settled lands. When a tribe or city surrendered, Whole communities could be given to commanders as personal property, not as state units, but as appanages to men who had won reputation by sword and decree. The political logic of the steppes was enacted in the trembling daily details of conquest. That process produced unexpected forms of human fusion. Captives and enslaved artisans were absorbed into Mongol households, learning new tongues, keeping old crafts, and sometimes rising in status through service. Children born in those mixed households might carry the blood of both conqueror and conquered, the skills of a settled craftsman alongside the instincts of a horseman. Over time, these blended lives became living proof of the cultural and social alchemy forced by war. In towns and agricultural valleys, the same logic took a different shape. Entire neighborhoods, guilds of craftsmen, even groups defined by territory were parceled out to military leaders. Those commanders tapped the local economy, levied taxes, redirected labor, and imposed demands according to their own needs. Crucially, in these early years, there was little effort to step into the old administrative machinery. The ministers, the scribes, the clerks who had kept cities running were seldom used as instruments of rule. Old provinces and prefectures were brushed aside as if dust on the hoof. Instead, the Mongols created pockets of control, personal fiefs, where the commander's word was law. Imagine a capital city at that moment, mighty courts falling silent, palace corridors that once rang with ceremony left empty, bureaucratic colors paling beneath a foreign banner. Mongol rulers rarely tried to reconstitute those offices in full. Their governance could be efficient in a crude, martial way, immediate, demanding, often brutal. But it lacked the comforting continuity of the old administrations. Local governors and tax collectors who had kept predictable routines found themselves replaced by strangers who measured loyalty by service to a commander rather than by an oath to a throne. The composition of Mongol power itself added another layer of complexity. This was not a monolith issuing direct orders from a single court. Numerous local commanders and chiefs enjoyed remarkable independence. They answered to the Khan in name, but on the ground they frequently acted with wide latitude. For the ordinary person, fate often depended less on far-off imperial edicts and more on the temperament of whoever held sway nearby. The Khan's court set the broad compass. The daily winds were local and often capricious. The emotional texture of those years is hard to overstate. For the conquered, life under the new regime meant living beneath a constant pressure. The fear of being uprooted, of having one's village given away, of seeing kin separated and bound to strange masters. For the Mongols, there was the stern, pragmatic business of consolidating victory, securing supplies, moving people who could sew armor or cook, and binding troops and retainers to loyalty through grants of land and labor. These exchanges were not merely economic. They were social engineering by force. Slavery and servitude became instruments of policy as much as tools of survival, ways to fill the needs of a conquering elite and to remold conquered societies into extensions of steppe power. This early phase of domination bore the stamp of ruthless exploitation. Commanders drew upon local resources, levied labor, and extracted wealth with few restraints beyond what military control required. Strong military pressure accompanied these measures. Garrisons were planted, patrols moved through countryside, and the ever-present threat of punitive action kept subject populations in a steady state of wary compliance. The harshness was not random cruelty. It was an embedded feature of how empire was secured in those decades. That era of decentralized predatory conquest held sway for a span of years and became a defining characteristic of the empire's first phase, roughly until 1234, about 7 years after Genghis Khan's death. The pattern prevailed. People parceled out to commanders, prior bureaucratic systems sidelined, local Mongol leaders acting with autonomy. That was not a story of neat administrative handovers or quick cultural assimilation. It was the story of a people of the steppes, imposing by force and design, a social order shaped to their own rhythms, reshaping entire regions in ways that would be felt for generations. Power in the early Mongol world rested squarely with the Khan. He ruled with the advice of military and political counselors, men whose voices carried weight, even though a full departmental administration had not yet been built. The Mongol armies were tightly organized, a strict hierarchy honed for war, but that same order did not immediately extend into civil government. Counselors were appointed by the Khan, regardless of nationality, and their influence was real. One of the most consequential was a former Jin subject, the Khitan Yelu Chukai, 1190-1244, a brilliant administrator steeped in Chinese learning, who persuaded Genghis not to turn all of North China into pasture. Uyghurs served at court, their language used in the chancery alongside Mongol, and their script was adopted to write the Mongol tongue. The oldest known Mongol language document we have is a stone inscription carved around 1224. A small, enduring trace of a people in the act of making record. When the Mongol banners swept over plains and cities, conquest did not merely change who wore the crown. It unmade the ordinary routines of daily life. Administrative machines that once kept commerce flowing, courts, treasuries, councils, were often dismantled or abandoned. Picture governors' halls that had hummed with the quiet work of tax accounting and legal judgment, now standing empty, their ledgers half-burned, seals broken or carried off as trophies. Into those emptied spaces stepped the appanage holders, the Khan's sons, his generals, the scions of the conquering elite. They staked out swathes of land like improvised landlords, heirs to spoils and to responsibility they had rarely been trained for. Those men were soldiers first, and administrators second. Their priorities were immediate and stark. Keep the sword sharp, reward loyal followers, hold strategic points. And the patient, exacting work of shaping civil order was often neglected. A governor's job of balancing harvests and taxes, of repairing canals, of encouraging markets, of making sure a caravan could reach the next city in safety, was less compelling in the short term than garrisoning a pass or paying a retinue. So the day-to-day tasks that sustained economic life fell into other hands. The vacuum did not remain open for long. Fields still needed reaping, workshops still produced wares, and the tax streams that fed armies and shod horses had to be re-established. Appanage holders turned to those who already knew how local economies worked. Non-Mongol tax farmers, local elites and middlemen familiar with harvest rhythms and caravan routes. These intermediaries knew the names in the village rolls. They knew when a harvest would be good and where a caravan's goods were worth the most. They became the practical instruments of extraction. Their methods varied. In many places they were ruthless, squeezing tribute with a harsh hand. Elsewhere they were coldly pragmatic, calculating what could be taken without causing revolt. What they collected was passed up to the new military masters, but the collectors themselves were often men of the same ethnicity as the conquered, a layer of familiar faces placed between strangers and overlords. Thus in many districts it was not the Mongol conqueror sitting in a hall tallying receipts, but a succession of local officials and tax contractors who became the intermediaries of an empire. That patchwork of arrangements created a world without a single ledger. There was no unified financial architecture stretching across the empire's vastness, no single standard coinage, no coherent fiscal policy, no central bureaucracy to reconcile revenues and expenditures from one province to another. Each appanage became a tiny state in itself, a microcosm of its ruler's ambitions and restraints. In one region, exactions were methodical and predictable. In another, they were arbitrary and predatory. Trade, which depends on predictable rules and protections, found itself subject to shifting tolls and uncertain security. Merchants who had once relied on a known legal order now had to gamble on the whims of local commanders and the appetites of tax farmers. The consequences reached higher than village ledgers. At the top, the civil offices that in other empires coordinated law, commerce, infrastructure, and taxation were underdeveloped or deliberately eclipsed by military needs. Appanages enjoyed wide autonomy. They collected, deployed, and spent resources as they saw fit. That independence was useful for rewarding loyalty and for quickly mobilizing forces, but it had a corrosive effect. Without strong, harmonizing institutions, loyalties tended to be local. The bonds that tied province to central authority were thin ropes rather than iron chains. Because of this, the early decades after conquest proved a difficult season for economic progress. Money and effort flowed first to horses, armor, and soldiers' pay. Investments in irrigation, roads, market regulation, and stable tax systems were often put aside. The results were visible and immediate. Fields that might have produced surpluses were sometimes neglected or seized for immediate needs. Craftsmen saw markets shrink and prices swing unpredictably. Long-distance trade, though still possible across great distances, was hampered by unpredictable levies and the lack of consistent legal recourse. The very machinery that turns productive work into broad prosperity was weakened just when steady governance was most required. Under Genghis Khan and his immediate successors, then, the Mongol Empire should not be pictured as a single cohesive state in the mold of older polities. It was a vast agglomeration, a sprawling patchwork of territories, held together less by unified institutions than by the constant presence of military power. Where a centralized state might have replaced conquered administrations with a uniform bureaucracy, the early Mongol world relied on overlordship and on the improvised, often self-interested arrangements of those who profited from conquest. The result was an empire of striking contrasts, unrivaled energy and capacity for war and expansion on the one hand, and a civic life on the other that was still inchoate, its economic future uncertain until governance could be built to match its vast scale. Only when administrative structures matured and local arrangements were harmonized could the promise of the empire's size be translated into sustained prosperity. Until then, the Mongol world remained powerful in force, but fragmented in the quiet, everyday work of running a state. As the empire stretched outward after Genghis Khan's death, a familiar pattern kept repeating. A first stage of rule that was intensely military and at the same time surprisingly decentralized, that produced a real variety of practices across the territories. Newly conquered areas often felt the raw imprint of nomadic power, direct exploitation, commands issued by generals, and a mentality shaped by warfare and movement. But in regions that had been under Mongol rule longer, rulers tried to build a more stable state machinery, to consolidate power by using the administrative systems that were already in place. Picture the wind sweeping over a wide, grassy horizon, the same breeze that once carried riders in great arcs across the plains. Those riders came from a world formed by movement. Tents struck at dawn and pitched again at dusk, herds following seasons and water, decisions made for speed and survival. Politics grew out of that life. Councils around smoky fires, orders given by voice and gesture, loyalties bound to kin, authority proven in the field. They had no deep tradition of managing crowded cities, complicated tax codes, or the slow, patient work of settled government. When those horsemen entered cities and provinces beyond the steppe, they met civilizations that had spent centuries building offices and archives, magistrates who judged under carved eaves, and networks of roads and canals that collected tribute and supported armies. The result was rarely a clean replacement of one system by another. Instead, each region changed in its own way, shaped by the encounter between nomadic rulers and the administrative cultures they had conquered. In some places, the change was light and fast. A Mongol command came in, and the old institutions kept functioning, almost as before, beneath a new name on the letterhead. Elsewhere, the influence ran deeper, and the outward form of government shifted until it looked more like the old regime than like a Mongol one. Often the conquerors kept the seals and chancelleries, retained the scribes who knew how to tally levies and keep records, and leaned on local experts to run the day-to-day work of ruling. The result was an empire that was frequently less Mongol in everyday practice than people might expect. A Persian court with a Mongol ruling house, a Central Asian polity under Mongol princes, or a Chinese state, still run in the pattern of the past, though with different faces at the top. How a region changed depended a great deal on the absorptive power of the society that had been conquered. Some civilizations had long-established traditions of centralized authority and a dense web of civil servants, rituals, and laws. Those systems could take an outsider in, and to some extent, incorporate him without losing their basic shape. Other societies, perhaps because they were politically fragmented or had weaker institutions, were more ready to change. They shed old forms or reinvented themselves around the needs of their new rulers. China is a clear example. There the architecture of governance was vast and resilient, a central court issuing edicts, provincial administrations carrying them out, examination halls and a literate class that knew how to translate policy into practice. That framework acted like a scaffold. Even when foreign men sat on the throne, the machinery of government kept humming, supplying continuity and stability. Conquerors learned to govern through those existing channels, which meant Mongol authority could be exercised through a ready-made bureaucracy to collect taxes, enforce law, and maintain public works, rather than by inventing all of that from scratch. Across the empire, the picture changed from place to place, sometimes only slightly, sometimes dramatically. In courtrooms, you might find a Mongol edict hung beside an older provincial regulation. In caravanserais, traders talked in several languages as they balanced imperial demands against local custom. Officials moved through a choreography of old and new, robes and ritual updated with a step sense of urgency, formal protocols mingling with a commander's decisiveness. What looked like unity from a distance, concealed beneath it a rich tapestry of hybrid states. At one remove, official households still echoed the organization of a neighboring culture. At another, entire provinces behaved, in effect, as they had before conquest, though a foreign dynasty sat on the throne. If you listen closely to that history, it sounds less like a single, uniform takeover, and more like an ongoing conversation between conquerors and the conquered, between force and habit. What mattered, in the end, was the pragmatic willingness to use what already worked. The nomads brought military strength and a flexible political instinct. The settled civilization supplied structure, technical know-how, and deep reserves of administrative skill. Together they produced polities that, in daily life, were often more Persian, more Chinese, or more Central Asian than Mongol, even while Mongol dynasts lent their names and their power to rule them. The empire that emerged was not uniform in identity, but varied in character, shaped as much by the enduring institutions of the conquered as by the ambitions of the conquerors. The Mongols did not think of the empire the way later rulers would think of a state. To them it was not the private property of one man, but the hereditary holding of the whole imperial clan. Even while Genghis Khan lived, he parceled out the world he had made among his sons, dividing power into ulus, a Mongol term that meant authority over a number of tribes rather than a neat, mapped territory. Tolui, the youngest, kept the eastern lands, the old Mongol homeland, and the neighboring reaches of northern China. Ogodai took the western steppe, what we would today call northern Xinjiang and western Mongolia. Chagatai was given Kara-Khitai, an area stretching across parts that later maps would tie to northern Iran and southern Xinjiang. Jochi, who died before his father, had left his line to rule the lands of southwest Siberia and West Turkestan under his son Batu, the region that would become known as the Golden Horde. A fifth branch formed later when Hulegu, a son of Tolui, pushed through Iran, Iraq, and Syria and founded the Ilkhanid dynasty in Iran. From the start, then, the empire contained the seeds of division, a single family holding a vast, scattered inheritance rather than a single, indivisible state. This reality explains why the Mongol story after Genghis splits into two chapters: an era of relative unity under a great Khan accepted across the branches, and a later age when the separate realms moved toward full independence and no longer shared a single history. When the great tent of Genghis Khan fell silent, the steppe did not unravel into immediate chaos. Instead, the realm seemed to draw itself tight, like a bow held ready. Word of his death ran like a wind over the grass, and the old custom of the Kuriltai, the assembly of chiefs and nobles, called the banners back to the heartland. From every edge of the empire, horsemen came, wrapped in sheepskins, attendants shouldering stoves and kettles, the thin smoke of countless hearths stirring up against the cold sky. Around Karakorum, the center of the nomad world, there was a rush of talk and trade, solemn vows and quick bargains. It was public business and private negotiation by turns, all played out beneath the vast dome of Mongolia's day. At the heart of that gathering was the question everyone had come to answer. Who would be Khan? Yochi, thy eldest son, had died 6 months before Genghis, and his absence left a clear gap in the line. The Mongols had long leaned toward primogeniture. The eldest son inheriting seemed the simplest way to keep order. Yet when the choice came, that expectation did not hold. Chagatai, the next in seniority, might have seemed the obvious successor, but the Kuriltai reached a different judgment. Without the outbreak of open civil war, Ogode was selected and proclaimed Great Khan. The assembly named his reign to begin in 1229, a decision that would shape the empire's course for the years to come. Ogode established his seat at Karakorum, a city that rose like a cluster of tents and timber on the Orkhon River, the first hints of stonework marking the endless grass. From there, he governed an empire that continued to expand as if following the momentum his father had given it. Orders flowed from Karakorum, moving along a network that bound far-off commanders to a single will. Campaigns kept running on many fronts. Generals and commanders in distant regions acted with a great deal of independence, once instructed, each operating like a small sovereign in his own theater. But they were still linked to a center that gave coherence to strategy and conquest. That mix of local initiative and central direction became the pattern of Ogode's rule. The court at Karakorum was more than tents and orders. It gathered people whose skills matched the needs of a state that now ruled cities and subject peoples as well as tribes. Yelu Chuchai, who had been chief advisor under Genghis, continued in that role. Learned and steady, he brought the practices of administration and the cold arithmetic of governance to bear on a people used to the rougher rules of the steppe. Working beside him was Chinkai, a Karate Nestorian Christian who headed the chancery, the empire's office of pen and parchment. Under Chinkai, the chancery became the machinery that wrote the Khan's commands, kept records, and made the empire legible from one end to the other. Together, advisor and chancery head gave Ogode the tools to manage a sprawling, multi-ethnic domain, and their presence at court showed how Mongol power now rested on administration and a degree of religious tolerance as much as on the might of the horse. Ogode himself could seem a study in contrasts. Contemporary writers left mixed portraits, a man of stern temper and quick authority, able to strike a decision like a thunderbolt, and a man who loved pleasure, who enjoyed the rich cups and the warmth of a feast. He could push a campaign forward with inexorable will, and in another moment preside over gatherings of laughter and indulgence. His fondness for drink became part of his reputation, but it sat alongside a capacity for decisive action. That combination, iron purpose softened by earthly appetite, set the tone at Karakorum, discipline in the field, celebration in the tents. The Khan's voice traveled not by whim, but by a working system of relay and riders. Couriers and mounted messengers sped across distances that once seemed impossible, moving orders from Karakorum along a chain of hands and saddles until they reached a general on a far plain or the walls of a besieged city. Those commanders, once the Khan's will was clear, had latitude to seize opportunities, to adjust tactics to weather and terrain, to improvise as needed, so the empire functioned like a network, decentralized in its execution, centralized in intent. That arrangement gave it speed and flexibility, letting the Mongols act on several fronts at once, while still remaining, at least in structure, a single polity guided by a common center. In the years after Genghis's death, a kind of ordered continuity took hold. The Kuriltai had named a successor. Karakorum became the seat from which campaigns were ordered and laws sent. Advisors and clerks kept the records that made rule possible, and riders carried the Khan's commands until his voice was the shaping law across the plain. Between 1229 and 1241, Ögödei's hand held that balance. Old steppe customs meshed with new instruments of governance, and for a time, the Mongol world moved together. It was not the sudden fracture some might expect after the death of a founding figure, but a period of relative unity in which the empire, large and diverse, was kept in coherent sway. The last years of the Yurshin Jin dynasty felt like watching a great ship come apart in slow motion. Once a power that ruled broad stretches of North China, it now sat isolated, its borders clipped, its authority frayed. The decline was not sudden, but the final scene in a long drama of conquest and counter-conquest. The same momentum that had lifted the Jin to power carried within it the seeds of their undoing, displaced loyalties, simmering resentments, and alliances that could shift like wind. For a century the Jin had been conquerors, wresting the rich river plains from the Song and turning those cities into proof of their dominance. But history keeps accounts in more than victories. The people they governed remembered old allegiances, and over time those memories and resentments reshaped the political map. Into that already fraught landscape rode another force from the steppes, the Mongols, swift and disciplined, whose armies had already remade kingdoms across Asia. Their arrival did not simply bring new battles. It opened possibilities for old rivals to reconsider one another. The Song, once the Jin's victims, saw in the Mongols both a threat and a strange opportunity. Where diplomacy had failed for generations, pragmatism took over. Southern Chinese forces, long excluded from the northern heartlands, set aside old hatreds and joined with the Mongol tide. For the Jin emperor, this alliance was a nightmare. Enemies from the north and the south converged, turning the front into a vice. The Mongols brought mobility and relentless pressure. The Song brought knowledge of cities, roads, and people, an intimate familiarity that made every defense more brittle. Picture the Jin court in those terrible months. Banners that had once proclaimed triumph now drooped in cold rain. Lacquered halls dulled under the weight of bad news. Advisors whispering in shadowed corridors while generals paced like caged beasts. The emperor felt the squeeze of a pincer closing. Resources that might have repaired walls or bought allies were stretched thin. Morale thinned like worn fabric. Suddenly decisions had to be made not for glory but for survival, and the sphere of choices narrowed with every lost outpost. All of this pressure focused on Kaifeng, the jewel on the river, and the proud capital of the Jin. It had withstood seasons of dread before, but by 1234 the grind of allied assaults and internal strains reached a breaking point. The city's narrow alleys and crowded markets, once places of commerce and song, became channels of fear. Smoke crawled across rooftops. Distant bells tolled for no one in particular. Families gathered what little they could, trading certainty for hope or prayer. When the Mongol and Chinese forces concentrated their strength, stone and timber met an enemy that knew how to exploit both. The final assault, when it came, was merciless. Towers that seemed impregnable were tested beyond endurance. Watchmen's cries were lost under the thunder of siege engines and the clash of blades. Violence moved through the streets like a contagion, quick, devastating, and impossible to fully contain. The symbols of rule, the palaces, the official seals, the ceremonial robes, proved powerless against the reality of an army determined to end a dynasty. When collapse became inevitable, the choices left to a sovereign narrowed to a few bitter options. Emperor Aizong confronted his fate in that ruinous year. Surrounded by the wreckage of the state he had inherited and the collapse of his city, he chose death on his own terms rather than the humiliation of capture. His suicide was a grim punctuation to an age defined by conquest and counter-conquest, a private act that marked a public ending. With his passing, the Jin dynasty's hold on North China dissolved, and their capital lay in ashes and memory. The fall of Kaifeng and the death of Aizong were both catastrophe and turning point. They showed how quickly political fortunes could reverse when old grievances met new realities, and how alliances of convenience could topple even long-established rulers. But beyond politics, the story is also profoundly human, of cities that held their breath and then were lost, of rulers who faced impossible choices, and of ordinary people caught between shifting powers. In the sweep of East Asian history, 1234 stands out as the year an old order faded, its last emperor gone, its capital ruined, and the map of the region forever altered. In 1236, a new current of thunder rolled across the steppe, and from it rode Batu Khan. Orders were given, banners lifted, and the Mongol war machine moved west with a single, unyielding purpose, not merely to raid, but to fold whole lands into the ulus allotted to Batu, to bring cities and peoples from the Volga to the edge of Europe under one rule. That intention shaped everything that followed. Quick, merciless campaigns aimed at creating space, wealth, and loyalty for a growing empire. The first great blow landed on the Volga Bulgars. In 1237 and into 1238, their world was erased. Towns that had stood for generations were overwhelmed. Resistance was crushed with a ferocity that left ruined walls, smoldering roofs, and survivors scattered in the countryside. The chronicles speak of annihilation, a silence where markets had once hummed, orchards left untended, churches and workshops falling into ash. With the Bulgars removed, a gate swung open toward the heart of the Russian lands, and the Mongol advance moved through it as if stepping into a new theater of conquest. What they met was not a single kingdom, but a patchwork of city-states and princedoms, Novgorod's great fairs, Kyiv's cathedral domes, small fortified towns perched on rivers, wooden churches, and princely courts, scattered across forests and plains. Central and northern Russia was a mosaic of independent centers, each a bright and vulnerable jewel in a vast land. One by one, those jewels felt the sting of the Mongol onslaught. Armies that swept through were fast and purposeful. Where resistance held, it often lasted only a season, and where it broke, towns fell, and banners changed hands with grim efficiency. Yet the Mongols' westward river of conquest met a rival power not of men but of season. When their columns pushed toward the Baltic, winter took its toll. The severe Russian cold, a force that had long shaped the lives and fortunes of northern peoples, became a natural bulwark. Snow and ice slowed movements, tested horses and men, and forced campaigns to pause. It was winter that spared Novgorod from the sack that befell so many neighbors. The city's markets continued. Its wooden streets and piled furs remained, not saved by walls or arms, but by the hush of the season. Southward, the tide resumed with dreadful efficiency. In December 1240, Kiev fell. The storied capital, with its ancient lineage of princes and cathedral spires, was taken after siege and fire. The image lingers, siege engines lashing at walls, smoke drifting over domes, the quiet afterward when the fighting stopped and the city's life had been broken. Kiev's fall marked the collapse of organized resistance across much of the Russian lands. Princes who had once rallied men and resources found themselves exhausted, alliances frayed, and the web that had bound these regions unraveling under the weight of ruin. From those bloodied plains, the Mongol presence did not stop. They pushed into the southwest, into Poland, Galicia, and Volhynia, where farms were burned, settlements harried, and the steady rhythms of daily life were shattered by raids. Advance parties crossed rivers and forests. At their farthest western reach, they touched the outskirts of Breslau, the city we now call Wrocław in Silesia. To see those riders against the horizon, banners snapping like thunderclouds, must have felt like watching Europe's edge redraw itself. The shock of that reach was made brutally clear on April 9th, 1241, at a field near Legnica. There an allied force of German and Polish knights, led by Duke Henry II of Silesia, rode out beneath Christian banners to meet the tide. Mail clanked, lances lowered, cavalry surged. And then the Mongol tactics unfolded, feigned retreats, arrows that fell like a rain of iron, and sudden coordinated strikes. The allied force was crushed and scattered. The defeat at Legnica was a demonstration of the Mongols' battlefield effectiveness and a stark warning that entire armies could be broken in a single day. And yet victory at Legnica did not become a march into the heart of Germany. The Mongols chose not to press deeper into Central Europe, whether held back by logistics, political calculation, or the need to regroup and secure lines. They pivoted south instead. Their new aim was to consolidate power and link up with other Mongol armies already operating in Hungary. This turn changed the map of their campaign. The immediate prize was not Germany, but a broader strategy of coordination and domination in the Carpathian Basin. Across those years, the land itself became a witness and a casualty. Forests thinned where armies rode, rivers carried the debris of sieges, and villages listened for distant horns that might never sound again. Some cities rebuilt under new rulers, others were abandoned to silence. For some, the winter brought salvation. For others, even snow could not protect them from fire and siege. The campaigns of Batu and his commanders carved long lines across Eastern Europe, leaving shattered polities, displaced peoples, and a political geography that would take generations to settle. When you stitch together the dates and places, the annihilation of the Volga Bulgars in 1237-38, Novgorod's seasonal escape, Kiev's bitter fall in December 1240, the raids across Poland, Galicia, and Volhynia, the reach to Breslau, the defeat at Legnica on April 9th, 1241, and the turn south toward Hungary. You see more than a map of conquests. You hear hoofbeats and the crack of siege engines, feel the freeze of winter and the heat of burned towns, and glimpse the lives caught up and remade by force. Those facts on a page become, when spoken aloud, the human story of a world remade by the sweep of empire. The attack on Hungary did not come as a surprise to King Bela IV. For years, the Kipchaks, a Turkic nomad people from the Don and Dnieper steppes, had been pressed under Mongol rule. Under their chieftain Kutin, a large number of them fled westward and placed themselves under Hungarian protection. Batu claimed the Kipchaks as his vassals and demanded their return. When the Hungarian court did not answer, he warned that he would seek redress by force. Then, with that short warning, he sent his southern army into Hungary. From the wide breadth of the Eurasian plains came the instrument of that warning, an army shaped by generations of riding and fighting on grass like an endless sea. In the spring of 1241, columns of Mongol horsemen moved like lightning across the landscape. At the head of one such column rode Subutai, a general whose careful planning and relentless energy remade battlefields wherever he led. His presence was a promise that the assault would be swift, disciplined, and devastating. In April, those squadrons met the forces of Hungary at the river crossing of Mohi. Picture the plain, a low ribbon of water, churned mud, banners snapping, armored men forming lines to hold or break. The clash was brief in the sweep of history, but savage in its effect. Mongol arrows arced through the smoke and chaos. Cavalry wheeled, feigned, and struck at gaps carved by trick and speed. Hungarian knights, brave and heavy in mail and plate, found themselves outmaneuvered by tactics they had not faced, feigned retreats, sudden concentrations, the ungiving tempo of steppe warfare. When the dust settled, the Hungarian army had been shattered. Castles and towns stood stunned, and King Bela IV, forced from the center of power, fled across the mountains to the relative safety of Croatia. The conquerors did not simply ride through and vanish. In some regions, they began to lay down the instruments of governance as if to make occupation a lived reality. Outposts appeared. Envoys and scribes moved to organize levies, taxes, and obligations. Even coins were struck, small hard discs of metal that marked the attempt to turn conquest into routine. Holding one of those coins is like holding a tiny report of contact. A mint stamp, a bureaucrat's work, the hint of a foreign order trying to become familiar to towns and markets. Part of the reason the Mongols lingered was more practical than imperial imagination. The Hungarian plains, with their long, waving grasses, looked to steppe eyes a lot like the southern Russian pasture lands. Good ground for flocks and herds. Commanders imagined not just raiding, but settlement, lands that could feed large herds and fit into a pastoral economy. That mix of practical calculation and imperial appetite helps explain why, in some places, Mongol forces stayed long enough to institute administration rather than merely plunder and leave. Meanwhile, the Mongol story of those years stretched far beyond Central Europe. To the south and east, their forces had already been remaking maps, sweeping through Iran, into the mountain kingdoms of Georgia, and over the storied hills of Greater Armenia. Campaigns there were relentless, reshaping political life across the Near East. Some rulers fled before the onrush. Others tried to stand and were crushed. One such ruler, a Khwarezm sultan who had been a force in earlier years, tried to survive the upheaval. He fled from Genghis Khan's first assaults, later reconstituted power in northwestern Iran, and strove to hold his kingdom against renewed pressure. His resistance failed, and in 1231 he was murdered, an ending that underscores how personal fates and political calamities intertwined in those chaotic decades. To the north, the proud kingdom of Georgia bowed, formally accepting Mongol suzerainty in 1236, a decision born of military pressure and the hard arithmetic of survival. Then, late in the year 1241, an event far from Hungarian fields changed everything. On December 11th, the great Khan Ogodei, son and successor of Genghis Khan, died. His death was a political earthquake. Mongol custom required that the empire's leading men gather at a Kuriltai to elect a new Khan. Attendance was not mere ceremony. It was a demonstration of loyalty and a necessary move for anyone who hoped to secure or advance their position among Genghis's heirs. Faced with that summons, Batu and other commanders made the practical decision to pause their western campaigns. They withdrew from territories they had conquered, pulling back to answer dynastic obligations and take part in the stormy negotiations of steppe succession. The retreat was not complete abandonment of intent, but a retraction driven by political duty. The sound of hoofbeats that once thundered westward moved east again toward the Kuriltai. For Europe, and for Hungary in particular, the consequences were enormous. The year 1241 becomes a hinge of history. The Mongol advance reached deep into Central Europe, and then, almost overnight, receded. Had Ogodei not died when he did, and had the commanders remained in the west, Hungary was very likely to have been folded into the Mongol orbit. That near miss is a vivid example of contingency in history. Empires change course not only by strategy and force, but by the timing of a single death and the obligations that follow. So these years read as more than a catalogue of sieges and dates. They are a story of sweeping plains and mountain refuges, of couriers racing news and riders seeking pasture, of burning towns and trembling courts. They are also a story of coins struck in newly occupied mints, of rulers who escaped or were slain, and of decisions made at a distant council that reshaped a continent. In the space of a single year, the Mongol thunder reached the heart of Europe, and then by dynastic necessity, receded, leaving a continent to rebuild and a future that for a moment might easily have been otherwise.